Good evening and welcome. The Town of Los Gatos special meeting of the Town Council study session of November 19th, 2024 is now called to order. May we have a roll call, please?
Councilmember Ista?
Here.
Councilmember Ennie?
Here.
Councilmember Moore?
Here.
Vice Mayor Hudas?
Here.
Mayor Badami?
Here. At this time, I'm going to open verbal communications, and I have two speaker cards, the first one being Jeffrey Suzuki. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you for having me. Good evening. Although I am the Vice Chair of the Complete Streets and Transportation Commission, I will be speaking as a private citizen, a member of the public, although much of what I will say tonight has been formally endorsed by the Commission itself. One of the items highlighted in your packet is a recommendation made by the Complete Streets and Transportation Commission, the acquisition of a town-wide traffic study model. There is an ad hoc committee called the Beach Traffic Ad Hoc Committee, comprised of myself and Commissioner Eric Miller, which was formed with the purpose of drafting potential plans to maximize transportation options in the town during beach traffic hours. What Commissioner Miller and I quickly realized is that any plan that we draft requires both data and projections of how traffic would be impacted if there were larger scale alterations in the town's infrastructure. A couple months ago in September, the Complete Streets and Transportation Commission approved this recommendation. A model of the town's traffic is ultimately required to run any sort of simulations in order to understand counterfactuals, and to better inform what plans we might have for the future. A traffic model would be able to help us understand how traffic flows through town, how it flows through our streets when traffic is light or it's congested. It can help inform how traffic would be impacted if we decided to change how certain roads functioned, the signal timing of lights, and so on. So if we want to make better quality long-term decisions in the planning of our roads to manage not only for dealing with beach traffic, but for dealing with school traffic and commuter traffic, we should have a traffic model. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Maria has a question for, I'm sorry, Councilmember Risto. We just came from an informal meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Suzuki. I do have a question. Are you familiar, is this type of model something that exists that other communities have used, or is this something that would be created from scratch, or what are you envisioning for this?
So there are municipalities that do use traffic models, or which is generally a subset of what are called traffic simulations, which are effectively models in practice that operate on a wide variety of scales depending on which one that you get. So the general answer to your question is yes, cities and towns do employ these sorts of models. This type of model that we would acquire and develop on our own is really a better question for staff rather than for myself.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, our next speaker, Linda Swenberg. Please come forward. Welcome, Linda. It looks comfortable.
Hi, I'm Linda Swenberg, and I'm actually speaking about an item on attachment 4 that I have some history on, so I wanted to bring up. As background, I just got back from the 60-mile 3-day in San Diego, so obviously I love to walk and use our streets as a pedestrian, bicyclist, and have to drive disabled people around and just, regular stuff. So I love to walk. I know a lot about walking in my neighborhood and where the safety issues are. And I was really pleased with the improvements on Blossom Hill Road done in, I think, 2016 now. That was not this last improvement, but the one before that. In the lead up to that, they were considering getting rid of the pork chop island at Blossom Hill Road and Cherry Blossom, and I noticed this has made it onto attachment 4, although it's not very transparent here, but I'm assuming that's what this means. Traffic signal replacement and intersection improvement, it's almost $5 million. My question at the time that I sent to the town, Parks and Public Works and others in May of 2016 was, why are we doing this? I asked actually at a study meeting about this, a study session. And there was a gentleman, Jamie, who was an engineer talking about it. And he said that we're getting rid of the pork chop islands because that design is extremely dangerous for pedestrians. And I asked why. Is there any data to support that? And as an engineer, I actually went online and did the research, and the only thing that I could find about that was actually a study from the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine done in 2014, Design Guidance for Channelized Right Turn Lanes. And they did a lot of studies on this and on the safety of these turns to see if they really were an issue or if they're better or worse or whatever. And I sent this to the town, but I never got a response as to what was the scientific or evidence for getting rid of pork chops, other than nobody does this anymore. Channelized right turn lanes with yield control, which is what that is, were shown to reduce right turn delay so that it would help with traffic congestion. They also, they have similar motor vehicle safety performance to conventional right turns or shared through and right turn lanes. But the best part about them is that they have similar pedestrian safety performance to shared through right turn lanes, but it's better than conventional right turn lanes, which is what they might be turning it into. So why do this? No improvement. It's a lot of money.
Okay, do I have any questions for Linda? Councilmember Rennie?
One question. Have you observed the pork chop you mentioned at Shannon and Blossom?
It's Cherry Blossom.
Cherry Blossom.
And Blossom Hill Road.
Blossom Hill. Is that, during school times, is that pork chop overloaded with kids falling off of it kind of thing?
I don't think so, because I don't think, I haven't been there lately, but I don't think that the crossing guard allows that to happen. But I would have to look at it.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, and we haven't had any, as far as I know, accidents there. So.
Thank you.
Oh, okay. I wanted to say one more thing, but it's okay.
Did you have one more thing to add that might be said in like 10 seconds?
Yeah, I had to walk a lot in that neighborhood with a disabled person who had vision problems, and it was much easier having that refuge there and having the safe free right turn at that crossing.
Thank you. All right, our next speaker, Eric Miller. Welcome, Eric.
Good evening. I am also here, like Mr. Suzuki, on behalf of endorsing the town creating a traffic model for the town. I walked in as there was a question on, do other towns do this? And actually, I can speak as a member of the VTA BPAC for Los Gatos, representing Los Gatos. The VTA actually does traffic models like this of the larger Bay Area, but they may not get down to the, forgive the term, micro level of our town. So if we have a model specifically for us, that can help inform many, many decisions as we go forward around school traffic, around other times. Question from Hudes? Okay. Yes, so
Continue. You still have 2 minutes.
Thank you. Yes, I think this would be a large boon to town. In BPAC, we have heard from staff that they think this is a very useful tool for them to have in general, though as a member of the beach traffic ad hoc, we have been looking at things we can do, and this traffic model keeps coming back to, we're not professional engineers, let's give this to actual professionals who can simulate this before we go spend X millions of dollars trying this in real life. That's my time. Thank you.
Vice Mayor.
Sorry, I was just kind of getting to that point. I've had some conversations with the new head of the VTA and discussions about traffic study. Do you think it would be a good idea to work with VTA on a traffic study?
I will leave that up to staff. I do think there would definitely be benefits. I heard that VTA had a specific piece of software they're using, so perhaps staff would be interested in sharing that piece of software. But I am not a professional engineer. I will leave that to staff.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. Are there any virtual hands on Zoom?
There are no hands raised on Zoom.
Would anybody like to come forward with a speaker card before I close verbal communications? Seeing no one come forward, I'm going to close public comment, and we're going to move to item number 1, which is to receive an introductory report on the capital infrastructure needs of the town of Los Gatos. Welcome, Mr. Constantine.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. It's an honor to be here. I just want to introduce this before I hand it off to the Parks and Public Works Director. This was an item that was in progress before I arrived, and the way we're framing it today is just an introductory presentation into our entire capital improvement program. We know there are a lot of elements that we have not addressed. There's a lot of work that needs to be done, a lot of coordination with the Finance Commission in terms of the financial implications, and a discussion of how our CIP is formulated, how we ascertain what our needs are over the course of the next 7 to 10 years, and how we integrate that into a CIP that is meaningful, one that we can actually fund, one where we know what the total liability is that exists, and one that also contemplates how much of the general operating budget needs to be contributed to our capital improvement program. There are a lot of pieces that are not there. However, we are further along in several areas than a lot of other cities. Many cities have not done full assessments of their building as the town of Los Gatos has done several years ago, so that's a good thing. But I think as we go forward, we want to continue to refine, focus on priorities, and tee up in the CIP program things that we actually can do and have money for. So with that, I'll turn it over to the director.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Welcome, Nicole.
Thank you, Town Manager. Thank you, Mayor and Council. It's nice to be here. I'm Nicole Byrne. I'm your Director of Parks and Public Works. So thank you for having us. As the Town Manager said, this has been kind of an evolving process for quite some time. We'll go to the first slide and just talk about, as the Town Manager noted, we consider this to be a very preliminary discussion of where we need to get to and go to with regard to capital infrastructure. So this is definitely a first conversation of what we hope are a number of conversations. And really the overall goal of what we're trying to get to is to develop the look ahead required so that we can help you understand the annual costs associated with what it takes to maintain our town's infrastructure. And that means roads, trails, parks, sidewalks, street lights, street signals. So there's a number of assets that we own that kind of fly under the radar, but when they don't work, we know that they are not working. So I'm going to take you through kind of the background of what we had in the staff memo. We'll talk about the initial information we have on our existing assets, and then talk about some future needs that we know are kind of floating around and that need attention. So if we go to the next slide. So in attachment 1 of the staff report was a 10-year look back of our capital spending, just to have it all in one place and kind of highlight it. It's in the budget book, but it's easier to see sometimes when it's right in front of you in a staff report. And that report provides you background and information on all of the capital funds that we have available, showing you ending fund and beginning fund balances for each year, the amount of new funding that came into that particular fund in any given year, and then the amount of we expended or the use of funds in any given year. What's striking about that attachment is that most of those funds are restricted, meaning they can only be used for the purpose of that fund. So things like the gas tax, utility undergrounding, traffic mitigation, storm drainage funds, those can only be used for those designated purposes. So when it comes to project needs that aren't related to those specific items, we fall back to the GFAR. That is the General Fund Appropriated Reserve. It is the only account we have that is unrestricted for use of capital. The finance director gave us a lot of detail on GFAR. So in the attachment, you'll see there are some portions of it that are restricted, but generally speaking, that general fund transfer in each year that shows up as a line item in attachment 1 is what we have available for capital funding. So some trends that I think probably aren't hard to find when you look at that data, the ending fund balances on some of those special funds like storm drainage and utility undergrounding are quite high. Our grant sources have fluctuated dramatically. There was a big increase in 21-22 that was partly from FEMA grants. And then there's also a large grant that the West Valley towns received to do fire management work, and we acted as the fiscal agent. So that's why there was a large slug of grant money in that given year. And I think with that, we can head to the next slide. So attachment 2 of the report is hopefully looked a little familiar. I think the first time you saw a report that was similar to that was back in May of 2024 as we were going through the budget development. And we provided a look for each active project, that is projects that are currently in the capital program and have some amount of funding. We gave you the look back of how much the historic funding levels were for each project, and then we gave you a look ahead of how much we projected to expend in this given year. So for attachment 2, we gave you what we actually have spent and is on the books through September 30th of 2024, so Q1 2024. We definitely see that not all projects are spent out at 25%. We wouldn't expect that. Spending is not linear on capital projects. I'm sure you understand. So certain projects we know we weren't going to work on until later this year, like the Shannon Road repair and some of the vegetation management work. So we didn't expect to have spending on that in this quarter. We also know that for some projects that are active and under construction, or like curb gutter sidewalk and annual street repair, that work is done, but the billing is lagging. So while the work is done and we've spent millions of dollars, it doesn't show up looking quite like that yet in that attachment. And then we do know that some projects are having are a little constrained due to staffing resources. The roadside fire fuel reduction project and also the community garden and Lynn Avenue right now are a little bit floating with while we work through some staffing issues. Next slide. So now we're really into the meat of, that was the background, kind of where we are with the existing program. These next slides are really about the heart of where we want to go and where we need to go as a town. So attachment 3 of the staff memo, the town manager noted that we had assessments done of each building that the town owns in late 2021. They were delivered in early 2022. So each building has its own document and its own list of here are all the needs for this building. It had been bothering us for a while. We knew we needed to compile it into one resource so we could look at the whole picture. We were able to do that in spring of 2024. So that's what's reflected as attachment 3. We also, in 2022, the town had completed ADA assessments of not only the buildings, but other facilities and assets. So that was now incorporated in here. And what that gave us was this look ahead of, for our existing buildings, what do we need to spend annually just to keep the lights on and keep the building functioning? That doesn't include major upgrades or renovations that may be needed. It's really just the basic work of maintaining heating, ventilation, and cooling, maintaining roofing systems. This is very much, attachment 3, very much a first look at this data. It's also very much a living document. So as we work through items, we might pull them off. We know that there are items on there that maybe we want to push out a year or two or pull back and do sooner. So it's still a work in progress, and we'll continue to work for that. The point is that the information in there, taken at a high level, does start to provide us a look of how much should we be allocating and budgeting each year to maintain our buildings and maintain our assets. If we go to the next slide, we had a question asked about what does this information look like building by building, because attachment 3 gave you the totals. So this is the look building by building. So you can start to see that the Civic Center, this building we're in right now, is the top of the list in terms of expenses. You see that the theater is the second highest in terms of projected need, but I would also just note that projected need, a lot of it is pushed out. It's like in years 34, 35 and 35, 36. So while it's showing $3.4 million, it's not that we need that today, it's we need it over the course of the next 10 years. So with that, we can go to the next slide. So less mapped out is streets, parks, building improvements that aren't maintenance related, and information technology infrastructure. So attachment 4 captures all of those things. It does not map them out over the course of years. It just gives them to you right now as one look ahead. It is a long list. It's a lengthy list. We've been developing that list for a while, but as we prepared for this, we really went back through the general plan, the bike ped master plan, and really made sure that all of the things that as a town council has told us you would like to see done are captured, and that we understand what we need to do and what our next steps are. So the next steps are going to be with attachment 4 is what does that look like over a longer term? It also would include mapping out things like for the annual street resurfacing project, what does that annual spend look like over the coming years, and we will be mapping out all of these other capital things in a way similar to what we've done with facilities. And that list in attachment 4 I know is lengthy. I know it's a lot of projects, and we can have conversation about them. But we wanted to provide a holistic view. So the next slide rolls all of that up, all of this previous information. And so this is what we know of right now. And it's all in one lump sum. We intentionally didn't total this because the intention isn't to say, we need to spend all of this right now, or it all needs to be funded in the next 5 years. That's not the point here. The point is to show you kind of this overall big picture of what our needs are going to be. So if we go to the next slide, we also noted in the staff report that there are some things that are in the offing that we're hearing about in various stages of development. So with regard to the police operations, the chief has been very clear about the need for consolidation. And I think she's spoken with you about that. She has spoken with us about that. We have a capital project of $75,000 to look at what it would take to move the 15 to 20 staff that are here at Civic Center into the police operations building on Los Gatos Boulevard. Unfortunately, it's not an easy fit. For not only in terms of the fit up and interior of that building, but also the parking is not adequate to support additional staff. So it's not as easy as just saying, well, we're going to move them. And when we're going to do that in a couple of months, it's something we really need to think about. So we recognized that 2 years ago when we funded that project. Our plan was to be starting that analysis this fall. We are still planning to be working on that starting it in the next few months. So more to come on that because we don't know what the result of that analysis will be and what that will look like. I noted earlier that the Civic Center needs $6.8 million worth of long-term maintenance just to keep the lights on. But we also know that this building doesn't necessarily reflect current community needs. It is quite old and hasn't had a major upgrade and renovation. So we're suggesting that we should probably do a similar study for this building that we plan to do for POB. Like, what do we really need to use it for? Who needs to be in here, and how do we fit them all in here? And what is it that the community needs from this building and this space? And then we also noted in the 2040 general plan, we captured a lot of items in the attachment 4, but there were a couple of items that are bigger. One was, and there were 2 significant assessments called for, feasibility studies for new community assets, one for a performing arts center and one for a history museum. And these were both in element 6, the public facilities, services, and infrastructure element of the general plan. So those, we haven't added them to a list yet, a future need, but we do recognize that we've essentially been directed to look at that and consider that. And so with that, we can open it up to questions. Thank you for reminding me. The last slide, our next steps. So we'll continue to work on this and we'll continue to refine it. I know that the new town manager has a lot of thoughts about this and is giving a lot of direction, which is super helpful. We're looking forward to working on this and figuring out how to refine this. We will be back. Like we said at the beginning, this is the first of what we expect to be many conversations to refine this and kind of get us working in the right direction. And the overall goal is just to use this as a budgeting tool to understand what we need and then figure out how we can deliver that through Parks and Public Works or other departments, deliver the services that are needed. And with that, I will close it for questions.
So thank you for the report. We appreciate it as the start of a conversation. I'm going to go to Councilmember Rennie, followed by the Vice Mayor, followed by Councilmember Moore.
So I want to start with two questions and then it's kind of a clarification. The first one on page 3 of 6 on this report, you talk about the staff needs to be able to implement the capital projects. I'm wondering what effect private large-scale construction, i.e. builder's remedy projects, if a lot of those get thrown into the hopper, how much does, I know it's going to affect PPW quite a bit on inspections and so forth, but I mean CCD, how much will it affect PPW? And is that something we're going to need to plan for affecting our ability to deliver capital projects, basically is the question.
I will start answering that and then invite the town engineer to chime in if he'd like to, but we're already feeling that effect dramatically through the need to review these permit applications at an accelerated pace with only 2 staff working in our land use team. So we clearly feel the impact now. Generally speaking, my observation has been that most of the infrastructure associated with these new developments is private. So the roads have been private, like North 40, those are private roads. So we are working, I think, at a staff level to try to minimize the future impact and the future, the addition of new town assets. And I'll invite Mr. Heap to correct me if I'm wrong about that.
No, I believe you covered that very well.
Second question, if I could. In your chart in attachment 1, one thing that stood out to me, it shows our undergrounding fund over last 10 years or something, which is about the time that I've been on council. And I remember us starting a project with underground funds, I thought on Los Gatos Boulevard, that was supposed to be, again, trying to remember, it was many years ago, around $1 million, but none of that's showing up. It only shows about $75K being spent. So I'm wondering, am I confused or is there a mistake in here?
I really appreciate that you asked this question because I was equally as confused and I had to really think about it. The undergrounding project that we did was actually with Rule 20A funds through PG&E, and PG&E delivered the project, and that's done. And so it had shown up in the capital budget for a number of years, but it didn't touch this local funding. So the utility undergrounding fund that's here is actually an impact fee that gets assessed on new construction to allow for undergrounding.
Okay, and the third one, kind of quickly, is a bit more of a clarification. It kind of struck a chord with me on page 5 of 6. You mentioned the bicycle and pedestrian master plan being unprioritized, and I wanted to kind of clarify that what we did, most people weren't here actually when we first put that plan into place, is we created the plan and then PPW came to us and said, what would you like to do first? And then we did those things. We nailed Blossom Hill at Roberts Road, and we needed to correct that, and then we did a Class 4 on Blossom Hill Road. We've now got, and I think we did a couple other things. Los Gatos Almaden was one. We did Winchester Class 4 bike lanes. So each time, kind of as it freed up, PPW came to us and said, okay, of these, which do we want to do next? Currently we have, I would say, a full hopper because we're still trying to finish off the Shannon Road. We're talking about a bypass for Lynn using the right-of-way under the high tension lines. The bridge from Route 9 down to the trail is still ongoing. We've been talking about getting started Kennedy Road. So it's like, I wouldn't say it's unprioritized, I'd say it's full right now, and it isn't yet time to come back and ask us for a priority. So I just kind of wanted to clarify that statement a little bit.
No, and I appreciate that. And yes, and I'm sorry if that doesn't read, the memo doesn't read the way it should, because I don't think we've unprioritized them. And I will just let the council know that, so the first tranche of Measure B funding, which is what you would have prioritized with Winchester, Kennedy, Shannon Road, is going to expire soon. So VTA probably next year or two will be asking us for our next 10 years of priorities. So we will be back asking you that question again.
Vice Mayor, followed by Councilmember Moore.
Thank you. Thank you for all of this work and for this analysis and putting it together. I've always known that your department has worked to estimate projects with a lot of effort and a lot of detail, and I think our challenge with capital has been the decision-making on top of that work. And one of the missing pieces was how we were going to fund capital, and so just rather than just having a big list. And so this is a really important step forward, and I understand that you may have initiated this as well, so thank you for that, for getting us going in this direction. I had just one process sort of information question, and then I have a bunch of project questions, but I'll wait on those. Looking at the two tables that are in here, the capital expenditure and project status table, that ends on page 12, and then the next one, which is the Town of Los Gatos facility needs projection, which I think has a longer time frame. What's the relationship of those two tables, and should we see everything in the 5-year table on top recategorized in the bottom one, or are there new things in the bottom one? I just wanted to understand that relationship.
No, I appreciate the question. There currently is no relationship, generally. There's a couple of exceptions to that. So the first one, the capital expenditures and project status, that is your list of projects that are currently funded in the existing CIP. That doesn't mean they're fully funded. So, for example, in this project, what is attachment 2, the capital expenditures and project list, you will see the State Route 17 corridor congestion relief project, and you'll see, past funding and potential future funding. You will also see that in the next, actually it's in attachment 4, where we know we still need $11 million of matching fund. So there are some projects that you might see in both lists if they're not fully funded, but generally speaking, there's not a strong relationship between the two.
Councilmember, I think you asked an excellent question, because one area that I see towns and cities don't do a great job is the cohesiveness of the entire CIP program. The 5-year CIP budget that you approve is really a plan. And so we list out projects that you can see for the next 5 years. It helps us project its impact on the general fund and other special and capital funds. And a lot of the times we're not delivering on all the projects that are listed in any one year. It may be staff capacity to complete it. It may be the process. It may be funding related to those projects. However, we have a hard time taking a look at those listings and saying that's way too much, cut it back. Because then when we convey to the public, instead of $8 or $11 million worth of projects that we're saying we're planning on this, but we only ended up with $2 million, that doesn't look that good to the public. And so I think the view we really need to take is take a very big step back and ascertain what do we really have and where are we? What's really, really important? A bicycle path doesn't take a higher priority than failures of the police department in an area that could impact their critical service. And so we have to start making those trade-off decisions of here are the things that are the most critical, and then program in the budget those that are, 1, funded, and 2, we can deliver, and then tee up those that, as we can deliver more, start to allocate funding. So one of the areas I want to look at the CIP, the 5-year, would be to do a tier 1 and tier 2, where when we approve the budget next year, the tier 1 projects are the ones that we are funding and absolutely know, based on our current status, we can deliver. It may be $1 million, it may be $2 million, and then to list out what's next. And so we'll list those next on the 5-year CIP, but they will be unappropriated and unfunded. And so as we move during the course of the year, and we know we have staff capacity and funding identified, and it doesn't negatively impact the fiscal position of the town, then we can come to you and say, we'd like you now to appropriate that budget for that item, and it may be March in the fiscal year, to then start proceeding with it. That's just one component that we're trying to implement.
Yeah, thank you. And it was very helpful to see the summary by building as well. It also surprised me that we were only planning to spend $310,000 on IT, in a world that's shifting to an information world. I'm sure some of it's in other budgets, but that one caught my eye. It's very helpful to see those subtotals. So thank you.
If I may, Madam Mayor,
Yes.
you hit on an item that identifies one of the issues for us. $300,000 of IT isn't adequate. We haven't fully captured the total amount of IT that's needed over the course of the next 10 years.
Councilmember Moore.
Thank you. So first, I really appreciate you bringing this forward. I think I really like this approach of trying to help us think about putting away funds every year to fund the things we care about, right? That we need to, if we want to fund, the 17-9 project, we really need to, work on making that happen. And I think from a staffing perspective, and I think we'll get to this in later conversations maybe, but I think it makes a lot of sense to help hone this down so we can have staff spending a lot of time on a small number of projects rather than being spread very thin on many things and not ending up making things happen. So I had two questions, although the manager sort of answered the second one. First question on attachment 3. So for my understanding, are we primarily underfunded on these future capital projects, what in the attachments is called streets, parks, and other needs, or are we also underfunded on these facility needs? Because it's a little hard to tell, looking back and forth between attachment 1 and 3, if we need to think about putting more money into the facilities, or if we're kind of okay there.
I think it's a little early to answer that question, but at a very cursory level, I did, when you compare attachment 3, the results in attachment 3 and the annual estimate to what we fund in the operating budget into the building fund or facilities fund, there is a disparity there. But I also think we can, over time, as we spread the facilities spending out, like we'll work on that, normalize it a little bit, I think. And then with regard to attachment 4, the streets, parks, and other needs, I think we have a lot of work to do on that. I don't think we have enough funding to cover all of these needs, but I think to the town manager's point, what do we prioritize? How do we prioritize it? How do we cover the basic stuff that we need to keep streetlights working and traffic signals functioning? And then what can we fund beyond that? Like, that's the answer we're trying to get to. And then we can talk about what the rest of the priorities are.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think to that point, my other question was, I love this kind of tier 1, tier 2 suggestion. I think that makes a lot of sense. I think we will, for me, I think tier 1 and tier 2, I think mostly would mean an order of operation or active passive, sort of, because I do think there are projects that we want to spend more time and energy on and take time and energy away from other projects. And so I think that's important. So my question there is, when we get to CIP this year, will there be a sort of reprioritizing? Because I think I think in past years, at least speaking for myself, when we've done CIP, we have this giant list of all of the greatest and best projects we could think of in the town of Los Gatos, and we see, number 47, we're like, great, we'll get to that, that's going to be really good. And I think now at this point, we're saying 47 is not going to happen, in the coming years. And so for me, I would want to think long and hard about, is there something halfway up that really needs to be moved up if being lower really means it's not happening for a little while?
It's a very complex question, what you're asking, but it's very important. I think we need to go to the way we're currently funding capital is we're contributing every year to the appropriated reserve somewhere over a little over $1 million. And that appropriated reserve is available to then allocate out for capital projects. And then we have a number of other funds. The real question is the reserve adequate for the projects that we need to perform? And is the annual contribution sufficient to keep progress towards the funding required for when replacements and rehabilitations and construction needs to occur? And the answer is, I don't know definitively, but I can tell you for a town our size, $1 million a year is not going to be anywhere near that. And so when we talk about priorities, there's really going to have to be a trade-off decision. And I will say this about our abilities to decide. If we had $1 million to spend on something and we asked what should we do with it, we would have a lot of calls towards that $1 million. That would probably be in excess of $10 million. You know, we're going to hear about one at the next council meeting. We have a bike master plan that has millions of dollars of improvements. There's streets. There's just a lot of needs for it. So I think what we really need to do is take the step back and maybe take a year to reset what our expectations need to be and understand what is important. Because my obligation is to recommend to you. I don't want to just defer and give you a tough decision without adequate information. I need to be able to provide something to you that's coherent. And my number one priority is very basic. The foundational service that we provide to our community is priority number one. Police response, police services, priority number one. And so if the capital improvement program includes $8 million of projects that are a variety of the priorities that the town has, but I need to ensure resiliency in our police operations, we may be looking at completely rejiggering and police operations, and potentially the move to the new building takes the first priority. But that's something we're not ready just yet to present. This is where more internal analysis needs to occur in discussion with the Finance Commission and then recommendation back to you.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's very helpful. And so I'll just end with, using the bike ped master plan as an example. If we're going to get to a place where we only are working on 3 to 5 projects, over the course of a year, I think we need to really think about what are those 3 to 5 projects.
Councilmember Risto.
Thank you. I think my other council members have hit a lot of the points. I do have immense gratitude for the way all of this was pulled together. I feel like whenever we have a conversation about any capital project, what's always left in the back of my head is, where does this fit in? As we do this, are we increasing our liability on something more to maintain? What are we not paying for? And I feel like every time we allocate money for something, we're not allocating money for at least 10 times more things. And so it will be very helpful to get a prioritization out of an understanding of the whole universe of things we have to deal with, including day-to-day operations, the maintenance, opportunities. There's a grant. Gee, if this is a project we really, really want to do, but maybe we weren't planning to do it for 2 years, but the grant comes up now, at least we'll have a robust structure for how to make a decision. Do we jump on this and try to get going on it or not? I know, then there's always the surprises, like Shannon Road, where we have a road that suddenly must be repaired, and so that takes priority. Clearly, with our present needs for the police department and then ongoing needs in the future with growth, we need to make sure that our operations are as efficient as possible and that we prioritize that police operations, and that may mean making other choices. One of the things I also think about is what other projects come up because they're related. So, for example, as we were working on the Civic Center and doing a restroom or doing some other work, that triggers having to do the ADA improvement on the ramp. And so it was very helpful to see everything with the Civic Center, because one thing I have asked for, I think that we're going to want to do going forward, is make a real decision about how much money could we put into the Civic Center so that it can last another 20 or 30 years, or do we have to think about building something new? And so as we're going along that path, it's like, are we continuing to put money in something that we have to replace? And of course, we have to keep the roof from leaking and everything else. But I'm always interested in what kind of work we're doing now, and will that just, how far will it get us? Yeah, the triggering projects. The other triggering projects are when we do street paving. I appreciate, having worked on the bike ped master plan in 2016, having worked with commissioners that sometimes got frustrated where they wanted to set the priorities. Well, if we have a top 20 priorities, it shouldn't matter in which order they get done when they make sense. So, for example, if a road is paved, that's when the crosswalk improvements go in. And relating to that, I am curious, I didn't see it on here, but with the new law that went into place last January and that we'll really have to implement this year with the daylighting, where there has to be, I think it's more than 1 car length spacing before a crosswalk, that can really disrupt some parking. I don't know how we'll address that, what the cost will be just to implement that clear spot, or if there's things we can do I guess it's a question. Can that be solved by having bulb outs in places? If there's a bulb out, do you still have to have a parking space empty before the crosswalk?
I'm actually going to ask the town engineer to weigh in, but I will just say with regard to the implementation of red curb, we have been doing that case by case. So we just do it with our town staff resources right now as it's coming up. But I know there was discussion earlier this year about a holistic program, and I don't know if you can answer the bulb out question.
Because I would say enforcement also costs money, and I see people parking at red curbs every day, all day. They park in crosswalks. But I'll defer to the engineer.
Thank you very much for the question. You raised a very good question. With regards to bulb outs, obviously bulb outs provide, or curb extensions, a way to get those pedestrians further out into the visibility, not only so they can see traffic, but so that traffic can see them. I still think there's a requirement based on the law, and the way I interpret it is that you still need that required distance between the crosswalk back further for that distance. If you have a bulb out, part of that bulb out is taking up that parking, so there might be less removal of parking with a bulb out because the bulb out is taking up that parking anyways. So without a bulb out, you might be looking at 2 spaces. With the bulb out would take 1. You might need an additional space, but you still need that dimension based on the law that's going to go into effect January 1st.
Okay, well then, I mean, that's just one example where there's an unfunded mandate. It's going to cost us money to enforce. It's also going to cost us money. It's going to cost us parking spaces in very critical areas, and it could cost us money to do some type of infrastructure change that would decrease the number of parking spaces we lose, and so that would also be a balance. Anyway, I appreciate all of this. I mean, I love having all these puzzle pieces sort of out there so that as we have further discussions, they're in context. So, thank you.
Vice Mayor?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Councilmember Risto, for raising the point about grants. And I think that sometimes it's not well understood when you start looking at averages of spending. And so being a study session, I don't think we're going to vote on anything, but I have a suggestion that could be helpful. And, because grants vary really greatly year to year, and they're often used to fund new projects with community benefit. And so they could also be used perhaps for ADA compliance if we focused on federal grants and others for ADA, since ADA is taking a very large portion of our of the total dollars here. But I was wondering if we could note which of these items are grant dependent. In other words, we wouldn't do them if we didn't get the grant, in staff's judgment. And I think that we could then separate some things that are wish list, and then, in a given year, we could focus on those where maybe the probability of the grant is, 50% or 70%, and not on those where it's low. And I think that maybe staff does that instinctively, but it'd be helpful for the council, I think, as we move forward in this process, to understand the grant implications of these various items.
I just had a quick question. I want to make sure, since this is a study session, that we don't open public comment. There was a question on it.
Regardless of whether there's a decision to be made, there should be an opportunity for public comment.
Okay.
Okay.
I don't have any speaker cards, but I will open public comment so that, I'm sorry?
We did it already.
My question was, we open it for verbal, but I didn't know if we need to do it on this item.
No, because there's just the one item.
Got it.
All right, thank you. Question answered. All right. Vice Mayor, were you finished, or should I go to Councilmember Rennie?
Just 2 quick comments. I agree with the whole grant funding thing, but for me, it gets down to, I like the idea of, okay, which ones are highly dependent on grants is good to know, like we wouldn't do them if we didn't get the grant kind of thing. But we've got a long list of dollars, but I can't understand how much of that do we need to somehow pull from general fund revenue sources in order to make them occur versus grants. I mean, it's yet another corollary piece to that whole puzzle. Do you have a thought on that?
If I may, what I envision us doing is breaking our capital projects into 3 categories. You have certain assets that are perpetual, things that have a life cycle or manufacturer's end, a roof, an HVAC, things that are like that you can plan out when you're going to do it and not be surprised by some big operating impact with a $500,000 roof replacement. And so what we want to do is get to the point where we can calculate the future value of that replacement and determine how much money should be setting aside and how much we should be attributing each year to ensure that, let's say in the case of a roof, when we reach year 30 on a 30-year roof, the money is ready to go to expend on it. And while you don't have to necessarily, you could expend it and do a roof, you continue to extend the life of the roof if it's more advantageous. The next category ends up being perpetual assets, assets that don't really have an end date, roads, sidewalks, things of that nature that you absolutely need, but you have some maintenance schedule to extend the life of that asphalt and tangible asset. The last category would be other. And it's in the other where we then have to break that down a little further into absolute priorities that we know we've identified and they're in plans and they're set up, things that we can leverage grant funding for or are dependent on grant funding. And then as we look at grant funding, we really have to take a hard look at grant money isn't free money. So a lot of the times the grant money is available because there's some purpose that a federal, state, or other entity is trying to push. And by seeing this big dollar amount out there thinking, oh, we can get that money, instead of spending $5 million, we're only spending $2 million, we get this nice new shiny thing. But that nice new shiny thing has an operational impact and has a lot of other secondary effects that we need to consider before we just say yes. There's been plenty of organizations out there, including a local community college, that were the largest grantee, received the largest amount of grants, but the amount of staff that were dedicated to servicing that grant then impacted their ability to provide their primary service. And so as we look at those grant funds and determine what absolutely needs grant funds, we need to determine if we didn't get the grant funds, would we be doing it, because it's a priority. And the other ones that if we didn't have the grant funds, we potentially would not be doing it. And then determining when we know what it means if we did do it to our primary operations, then would you still do it irrespective of whether you got the grant money?
And then my second comment quickly, the Civic Center has been mentioned that, $6.7, $6.8 million of ongoing maintenance. For me, that number's starting to get large, and there's the question in my mind, I think, as Councilmember Risto mentioned, whether we should just rebuild rather than invest too much. So I'm in favor of this idea of a study to try to figure that out. But then I wanted to introduce the idea, if we get to the point that we think we want to rebuild, we're also talking about wanting to build a new refreshed adult rec center kind of thing. And does it make sense to combine the two into the same building? Would that be more cost effective, build a larger building that could do the two of those?
It's a larger question. When we look at the operations that are currently here, if we exclude the library, we generally have office type of activity, so that there's, other than the location of being convenient, there really isn't something unique about the building that we're in for most of the operations that we offer here. The town clerk, the town attorney, the city manager, the town manager, community development. Police is the one use that's here local that is really unique in the sense that we have infrastructure, microwave and towers, the dispatch center, the need for a 24-hour operation. Once you address that unique need, which it looks like there are plans that kind of outline what the desire is, the rest were just office space. And so when we look at the question, is the return on the taxpayer's dollar better served by rehabilitating or rebuilding, we also have to add to the equation public-private partnerships, lot swaps, and a bunch of other options that cities and towns consider to say, what's the biggest bang for the buck for the public? And then overlay with that, in this new world of how we deliver service, where a lot of it is done from afar, where folks don't need to actually come in to a building to transact that business, is the footprint and how we do it adequate for that activity?
Okay, Councilmember Moore.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, I would just double down on what Councilmember Rennie's talking about. I think as we think about that Civic Center study, I think it makes a lot of sense to, think big about that, especially, as we're getting up to these, very expensive dollar amounts of just ongoing maintenance. I also think it makes sense to at least look at our options and as we're thinking about, the Adult Rec Center. So I agree with everything Councilmember Rennie just said. I would also just point to somewhere very different than the town of Los Gatos, but Sunnyvale just did a major remodel of their Civic Center that incorporated, a nonprofit and community center space on the bottom, and all of their sort of civic activities are on the upper floors. I don't think we would ever do anything quite that scale, but I think something good to look at. Just a few other quick comments. One, I would just say I support what Mr. Suzuki and Mr. Miller were talking about with traffic simulations. I think that's a good thing to look into. I like the idea of working with VTA to make that happen. And then on these projects that I think we haven't, in my time on the council, we haven't talked much about, like a history museum or a performing arts center. I think those are the things we really need to think, is that at all, sort of in our tier list of things that we care about funding at this point. And so I think, having an honest conversation about those general plan 2040 topics, because I think something like Civic Center, redo, or, plus community center would come before a performing arts center, for instance. And then the last thing I'll say is, I think as we're thinking about, the CIP this year, I think as we try to get creative with our money, things like asphalt repaving that could maybe go, be done a bit less often, where we could save money and put more money into, sort of projects that we care more about, I think is something worth thinking about. I think about this because I just had my street repaved, and to me, it looked like it was in pretty good shape. And so I was, I wonder if things like that could potentially be stretched out a little bit further in order to fund more of the things we really want to fund.
So I'll just throw in one quick comment because I haven't said anything. So I just want to say that I'm pleased with the idea of the tier rating. I like the idea of each project being evaluated as to a sense of urgency and to the importance of the betterment and well-being of the town. Councilmember Rennie.
Just a quick reaction to Councilmember Moore. We want to be careful about playing around with road maintenance, because if you don't do the cheap road maintenance, you get into the rebuild, which is more expensive than if you had done the road maintenance. So we've tried to get out. We started 6-8 years ago, we were about a 64 rating. Now we've come over 70 somewhere, and that helps us then just be doing cheaper maintenance versus rebuilds, because our roads don't drop as far in. And there may be other places in our facility maintenance also that same thing makes sense. If we caulk instead of letting everything rot and have to be replaced. So we want to be careful about being penny wise and pound foolish, as the saying goes.
Okay, Councilmember Isto.
Yeah, and to add on to that, I mean, the higher our PCI is, if we stay above a certain level, then we have Measure B funding to use for other things as opposed to road paving. So there is money that's dedicated specifically for road paving. And, as Councilmember Rennie put it, that there's analogies all along the way. So I think that it's important for staff, whenever something like this comes up, to give us the choice. And it's like, okay, if we defer maintenance, great, we have money for something, but are we going to be paying a lot more later?
Any further comments?
Oh, I had one other question. Thank you. We have another section of Blossom Hill Road that we have had a study done with the city of San Jose, the part of Blossom Hill Road in front of Gatos. And so presumably the Gatos neighborhood, presumably the decisions made for traffic calming and safety there are going to have to work in tandem with the city of San Jose. And so in that case, we'll be working kind of at the same time, or it won't be up to us, or it might be up to us. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, we did create a new capital project last year because we received a federal Safe Streets for All grant. We're in the process of executing that grant agreement right now. We are the lead agency, so we are working with San Jose Department of Transportation, but we will be the lead implementer, but we will cost share the improvements that are done. But the analysis and the grant is really for a quick build evaluation and implementation, but it has not started yet.
Thank you.
Okay, any further comments? We're coming up on time where we need a little bit of a transition before the 7 o'clock meeting. This has been a very productive discussion. We look forward to many more. And with that, this meeting's adjourned.